All right, this is a really great topic, multiplying and dividing. Luke. Hi, Luke.
Hi.
So we're going to be talking about multiplying and dividing. Rational numbers, we're going to be talking about integers, positive and negative, and even fractions, okay?
Okay.
Okay, so now, at first, this might seem really tricky, but let's first just start off with thinking about how negative numbers work in the real world, and that'll really help you to make sense of multiplying and dividing them, okay?
Okay.
Okay, so let's talk about a scientist. This scientist has an experiment that shifts the temperature by -2 degrees. Okay, each time the scientist does it, it shifts it -2 degrees.
Okay.
Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's think about this on a number line. Okay, so let's say the scientist started at 5, and they did one of the shifts. One of the -2 shifts would actually be just going -2 down to what number?
3.
3, right? Okay, makes sense so far?
Yeah.
Okay, now let's say the scientist did this several times till we got down clear to -3 here. So we did many of the shifts. There's one, there's another, there's another, there's another. How many total shifts would they get you down to -3?
4.
4, yeah. So 4 times the -2 shift equaled a change of -8. Let's just make sure that's true. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, yeah, so that's true. So does this statement make sense? 4 times the -2 shift equals -8.
Yeah.
Okay, but that's a lot to write, isn't it? Let's write this in math.
Okay.
Okay, so tell me, does this look like the same statement? 4 times -2 equals -8?
Yeah.
Okay, ooh, so let's say the scientist did 3 times -2. What would that be?
-6.
Good. What if the scientist did 9 times -2?
-18.
Good. -18. Now, we know with multiplication we can switch it, right? We can switch the direction.
Yeah.
So what if we now stop thinking about the scientist and just think about the math? What if we write -2 times 9? What does that have to equal?
-18.
That's right. -18. So now we're coming up with a rule here. Let's write it as a draft because we're not sure yet. And you can help me fill in the blank. Draft rule: multiplying a positive number with a negative number, whichever order you have them in, results in what?
A negative number.
A negative number. Very good. Okay, so that's our draft rule. Looks like it makes sense from the real world. Now let's take a look and see if we can prove that rule with math up here, okay?
Okay.
All right. So let's test this rule. I've set up this problem that is 4 times then the quantity, what's in parentheses, -2 plus 2 equals, and we don't know what it equals yet, and we're going to solve this in 2 ways, okay?
Okay.
Now, the first way would be to do your order of operations. What would be your order of operations here? What would be the first thing you would do?
-2 plus 2.
And what is that?
0.
0. So we could rewrite this as 4 times 0, right?
Yeah.
And what would that be? What's 4 times 0?
0.
0. Okay, so we know that this is equal to 0, right?
Yeah.
We've just proven that. Okay, now let's solve this in a different way. We're going to use the distributive property, which you might remember. Does that sound familiar to you?
Kind of.
Okay, good. So let's look at it and let's remind ourselves what the distributive property says. If there's a number outside an expression in parentheses, you have to multiply that number by each term in the parentheses, like these arrows are doing. So we have to multiply 4 times -2, and then we'll add 4 times 2. Okay?
Okay.
All right? So let's go ahead and write that out. And I've put a color here because what we're trying to do is we're trying to see if we can prove what happens when you multiply a positive times a negative. So we're going to say we don't really know what this is. Okay? But over here, so this is the 4 times the -2. Over here is the 4 times 2. We do know what that is, right?
Yeah.
What's 4 times 2?
8.
Okay, good. So we can rewrite this as 4 times -2 plus 8. But we know, because we already proved it up here, that that equals what?
Negative. Oh, wait, sorry.
What does it equal?
0.
0. It equals 0, right? Okay, so now we have to ask ourselves, well, what plus 8 equals 0?
-8.
-8. So this right here has to equal what?
-8.
-8. Okay, so we've just proven that 4 times -2 equals -8. And so we can now write it not just as a draft rule, and I'm putting it all in bold here. This is one of the most important things for you to know in math. Multiplying a positive and a negative is a negative. Okay?
Okay.
All right, now let's just think really quickly about doing this with a fraction. So what would 10 times negative 1/2 equal?
20?
Close. What's 10 times 1/2? Or what's 1/2 of 10?
5.
5. So what's 10 times negative 1/2? We're just doing a positive times a negative now. It'll be the same answer, but it'll just be negative. Just like 4 times 2 is 8, but 4 times negative 2 is negative 8. What's 10 times negative 1/2 then?
Negative 5.
Very good. Very good. Okay, but we know that multiplying by 1/2 is the same as dividing by what?
2 over 1.
Or just divided by 2, right?
Yeah.
If I multiply 10 by 1/2, it's like taking 10 divided by 2, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so we can rewrite this as this is the same thing as 10 divided by negative 2. And we know we have to get the same answer because 10 times negative 1/2 is the same thing as 10 divided by negative 2. So what does that have to equal?
5. Negative 5.
Negative 5, right? So now we can write another rule all in bold. Dividing a positive and a negative is a negative. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, wow. Well, if that makes sense to you, then you've learned really quickly here. Memorizing these rules is good, but you also know how to prove it. Now let's see what we can prove with negatives and negatives, okay? So I'm going to set up a very similar problem. Oh, wait. Before we get there, let's go down here and just ask ourselves if we're understanding this one, negatives and positives. So let's just ask ourselves which are true. Negative 2 divided by 3, or negative 2/3. Which ones of these would that equal? So let's ask ourselves, if it were negative 2 divided by 3, would that be the same thing as negative 2/3? We have a negative and a positive.
No. It would be the second one.
Okay, well here we have a negative and negative, which we're going to prove over here. But a negative and a positive, if you divide a negative and a positive, will it be positive or negative?
Negative.
Negative, so it would equal negative 2/3, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so this first one is true. Okay, so when you have a negative and a positive, it becomes a negative.
Yeah.
Following?
Yeah.
Okay, good. This one we don't really know, but it can't be the same thing because it's just a little bit different, but with a negative. So we're going to go ahead and cross that out and say that's probably not true. Now, does negative 2/3 equal 2/3?
No.
So we know a positive divided by a positive is not a negative. Okay, now how about this one over here? How would you think about that? It's a positive and a negative. So would that be negative or positive?
That would be negative.
Right, that's what our rules say here. So would it equal the negative 2/3?
Yeah.
Yep, so we'll circle that one. Okay, so basic rule that you want to memorize is when you're multiplying or dividing, a positive and a negative is going to be a negative. Okay, now let's go up here and look at negatives with negatives. Okay, let's find a rule, very similar example to this one over here. We're going to solve it in 2 ways. What would be the first way to solve it with your order of operations?
Negative 5 plus 5, which is 0.
Okay, so we could write it like that, right?
Yeah.
And what is negative 3 times 0?
0.
Okay, good. Now let's solve it the other way. Oh, wait, so we'll put our answer up here. This has to equal 0. Now let's solve it the other way, just like we did over here with the distributive property. We're going to do negative 3 times the negative 5, and then negative 3 times the positive 5. Okay?
Okay.
So let's write this out. What would we write? I'm remembering this example over here. Can you think what we would write?
Negative 3 times negative 5 plus 5.
Plus a negative 3 times the
yeah.
5. Okay, remember, that's what the distributive property says. So let's write this out. Does that look right to you? Negative 3 times negative 5, that's that first arrow, plus, just like that, negative 3 times the positive 5. Make sense so far?
Yeah.
Okay, now we're going to do the same thing we did before. We don't know what this is. We'll put that in blue. But now, because we have this rule over here, we know what negative 3 times 5 is. Can you think what that is?
Negative 15.
Perfect. Okay, so we have negative 15 here. We have negative 3 times negative 5. We don't know what this is yet, but we know when we add the two of them, we know that it equals what?
0.
Okay, so now we have to ask ourselves, what plus negative 15 equals 0?
15.
15, right? So this blue part here has to equal 15. So in other words, when we have negative 3 times negative 5, it has to equal 15.
Okay.
So can you think of a rule now that we can say about multiplying negatives by negatives? A negative multiplied by a negative would be what?
A positive.
There you go. There you go. A negative times a negative equals a positive. Kind of rolls off the tongue, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And let's look at division really quick here. We'll use the same kind of example, but instead of negative 10 times, instead of 10 times negative 1/2, we'll have a negative 10 times negative 1/2. It's a negative times a negative, so will it be positive or negative?
Positive.
Positive. And what will be the answer here?
5.
Good. So that's positive 5. But we can also, just like we did over here, we can rewrite this as negative 10 divided by negative 2, and that equals 5. So what would our rule be here? When you're dividing a negative by a negative, what would that be?
A positive.
A positive, right? Okay, so really quickly, let's review the rules. A positive and a negative, when you're multiplying or dividing, what is that going to be?
Negative.
Negative. And when you have two negatives, and you're multiplying or divided, what is that going to be?
Positive.
Perfect. Good job.